area, conversion disorders of the Trump era.
Can you speak more loudly?
Sure, yeah. There can be no doubt about the contemporary relevance of hysteria. Muslim bans, hordes of angry white voters gathered at Trump rallies, paranoid exhortations of media conspiracy and fake news by those in power. These are, without question, hysterical times. Yet, if we look at the other, more mundane pole of this very same moment, we see a decidedly less charged atmosphere. Eyeballs glued to a laptop screen for hours on end without so much as a blink, while images of the most catastrophic world events flash by without the slightest change in affect, without a glance in the other direction, or a twitch of the eyeballs. Just an incessant clicking. Jean Charcot, one of the more infamous pioneers of the modern study of hysteria, described a key feature of hysteria as a tetanization of the body, the involuntary contraction and immobilization of the muscles due ostensibly to an excess of physical intensity and sensation for the subject to handle. Now this corporeal immobilization seems rather to be due more to a dispersal and depletion of intensity. Dispersion, or to get to the point, distraction. Hysteria and distraction, these I suggest are the two apparently conflicting poles of the contemporary moment that perhaps are more related than they might initially seem. The common sense understanding of hysteria implies mass delusion and overwhelm, generalized paranoia, and loudly expressed anxiety. If that is what hysteria is, then we certainly have plenty of it circulating in the public sphere right now. Yet, more complexly, with appeal to its psychoanalytic origins, it's important to see that hysteria designates a vast, shifting set of behaviors and symptoms that is historically variable. As Elaine Showalter suggests, hysteria is a mimetic disorder. It mimics culturally permissible expressions of distress. Moreover, as Freud emphasized, hysteria is a conversion disorder. It entails a conversion between psychological dimensions and their manifestations in the realm of the physical through a socially legitimate symptomology. Because hysteria has always appeared, however, as somehow illegitimate, because it mimics socially acceptable, usually physical symptoms, but is in origin ultimately a psychic conflict, it has always contained within it a latent and perhaps unconscious form of social protest. Forms of hysteria arose to protest or resist normative conditions of subjectivity in a given historical period. In Victorian Europe, hysterical symptoms emerged as the eroticization of a feminine body whose sexuality was expected to be channeled into narrow bourgeois forms of genitally bounded pleasure. In the post-World War II era, soldiers returned home with shell shock, a neurosis in which men took on so-called feminine forms of response to violence. In the 90s, veterans returned from war with symptoms of toxic poisoning that many even claimed to have transmitted to their spouses through sexual contact. They seldom considered the emotional and psychological effects that an imperialist war might produce as a possible cause of their symptoms. And now in the Trump era, we have, I suggest, another variation of hysterical conversion. Currently, the label of hysteria is thrown about to diagnose political pathologies. The right critiques left hysteria with the usage of terms such as Trump derangement syndrome and post-Trump stress disorder, emphasizing that these conditions are hysterical because the affected individuals are somehow delusional and detached from reality. Leftists speak to the hysteria of white masculinity under threat, emphasizing the ascendancy of white male victimhood and the way Trump has manipulated it for political power. I think it's important to emphasize that for my purposes, such diagnoses fixate on the more superficial symptoms of a deeper problem. For the essence of hysteria is not delusion, but conversion. To grasp the social significance and critical power of hysteria, we need to see the way in which it converts social traumas, anxieties, etc., between the physical and emotional registers of experience, between unconscious and conscious forms of expression. The deeper dimension of hysteria in the contemporary moment, then, is not as such about Trump, I would argue, but produced as an expression of a deeper feature of neoliberal society and its emotional, somatic, and social terrain. This terrain consists of distraction, excessive cognitivization, misattunement, and lack of contact. In this moment, we can observe a predominant form of trauma and an omnipresent form of emotional misattunement, sustained and induced by the technologization of the social. The hysterical symptoms are the channeling or conversion of affective intensity, which in quotidian existence is dispersed through distraction into particular kinds of collective forms, including mob-like Trump gatherings, hate crimes, and dispersed forms of hive-like internet sociality, as on Twitter. Trump himself is a hysterical symptom of a sociopathic mode of existence elevated to normality and seeking expression. He is, as befits hysteria, absolutely unacceptable. And yet, perhaps he may point to deeper social pathologies in need of analysis and work, particularly in the social needs registered in his outrageous fusion of dispersed trolling internet sociality and hyper-immediate forms of collectivity that draw directly from the fascist handbook. My main interest in this regard is with the way in which a culture of distraction has impacted contemporary embodiment and affect, and ultimately contemporary political subjectivity. The preoccupation of social critics with the phenomenon of distraction is certainly not new, from Benjamin's distracted spectator to Baudrillard's promiscuous communicator to Debord's spectatorial subject. Commentary on the subtle contours of distraction has been an obsession of social critics for quite some time, and for good reason. As Dominic Petman notes in his recent book, Infinite Distraction, attention itself might be reconsidered as really but a specific form of distraction. Indeed, it is distraction that has become normalized in our society. Attention is the exception. What happens to a world, asks Petman, in which distraction becomes the rule rather than the exception? What happens to a world in which distraction is the very motor of its economy, both commercial and libidinal? This is a complex question. I am interested primarily in what the intensification of distraction entails for our political subjectivity in the current moment, and for the ways in which we live our embodiment and our political lives. Distraction, so it seems, takes us out of our bodies, dissociates us from our rootedness in the sensations and pulsations of the flesh. Yet this too entails a particular kind of embodiment. Just as we reckoned with hysterical symptoms and disorientations induced by the speed of modern life in the early 20th century, technologically induced distraction registers itself upon the physical body. The embodiment of distraction, I would suggest, involves the dispersion of jouissance, of the intensity of sensation in the body, rather than its foreclosure or displacement, as we saw in the classic cases of hysteria studied by Freud, among others. Hysteria, in its multiple shifting and historically variable forms, has always been grasped in its relation to specific forms of trauma, whether those be unwanted and early sexual experiences, as in many of the early hysterical cases of women examined by these early examiners, Charcot, Freud, and Breuer. The dizzying pace of modern life accelerating beyond our control, as in the masculine hysterias of the early 20th century, or the shock induced by the horrors of war, as in the syndromes of shell shock and Gulf War syndrome, all variously labeled as species of hysterical conversion disorders. In this moment, we could observe a predominant form of trauma in an omnipresent form of emotional misattunement, sustained and induced by the particular form that technology of the social takes right now. Dominic Petman observes that although grouchy critics of social media often worry about the problems of excessive homogenization, conformity, and synchronizing of the herd through social media, we face a potentially even more damning problem. Rather than synchronization, social media creates dispersion into countless different emotional micro-experiences. The problem then is not distraction as such, but the dispersion of emotional and social energies. The result is a constant state of misattunement, which has obvious effects for our political energies and how we channel them. As Petman writes, what if the problem, however, is not that we are all synchronized to the same affective networks and moments, but the objects of a more exquisitely sinister modulation? What if the herd, this is him, what if the herd is being directed into different pastures for quite different reasons? What if the raison d'etre of so-called social media is to calibrate the interactive spectacle so that we never feel the same as other potential allies and affines at the same moment? Petman refers to this phenomenon as hypermodulation, which I think is a very useful term. This persistent misattunement and dispersion of social and bodily energies, I am suggesting, is directly related to the eruption of mob-like fascist behaviors that are becoming ever more the norm in the Trump era. Dispersion of social energies in the mundane realm of social media, a site from which there seems to be no escape, translates directly into its discharge in the immediacy promised by the Trump rally, which shows no sign of ending, though the campaign is over. Perhaps on the progressive side, the outpouring of protests on the left, the women's marches, the protests against the Muslim ban, and the consistent sense of the need to protest on the left in a much more active way than at any time in recent history, can be seen as the promise that the revolt against dispersion contains, as well as where we might arrive if we work through the hysterical symptoms exploding like minefields around us. Thank you.